the mask. He married. My husband sent me a marriage certificate exactly one day after our divorce was finalized, and the woman on it used to be the girl our whole high school called ugly. I am Sophia, I am 36, and I want to tell you exactly how I found that out. Because the ending is not what either of us expected. I live in a quiet suburb outside Denver, and I work as an accounting assistant for a medical supply company. No children, just me and my husband Ethan, a sales team leader at a real estate firm, always polished, smelling faintly of cologne, the kind of man strangers assume you are lucky to have. Nobody outside that apartment ever knew how cold it felt inside it. The night everything changed was our 8th anniversary and Ethan's birthday on the same date. I took a half day off, drove across town for his favorite wine, and picked out a beautiful cut of Wagyu short ribs. I am not much of a cook, but I strung lights across the balcony, laid out an ivory tablecloth, and ordered a small vanilla cake with his name on top. By 7, I had my dress on and sat down to wait. At 8, I lit the candles. At 9, I texted him. At 9:30, I called and got 5 rings and voicemail. At 10:35, a short email finally arrived. No apology, just a line about a client emergency keeping him at the office and a promise to make it up to me. I set the phone down between the burned-out candles and the untouched cake, and something in my chest quietly shifted, though I did not cry that night. The next day, I called his office when he still had not answered a single message, and the receptionist told me, almost apologetically, that Ethan had resigned 3 days earlier and left no forwarding information. I stood frozen in the hallway of my own workplace as the truth settled over me. This was never about a client emergency. He had already been planning to vanish, and I was the last person in his life to find out. When I got home, the shoe rack had an empty space where his brown leather shoes always sat, and I found him in our bedroom packing a suit and dress shoes still wearing their tags. Clothes he never wore to any ordinary meeting. When I asked what he was doing, he looked at me like I was a stranger and said flatly that he had accepted a new position in Albuquerque and was leaving. He pulled a slim folder from his bag and set it on the table, and when I opened it, I found divorce papers waiting for my signature. I asked him what any of this meant, and he told me, with eyes like steel, that I was no longer the wife he needed, that the house was always dusty, that I put work before him. I reminded him he was the one who came home late claiming he had already eaten, who told me not to touch his desk, who never once asked if I was okay, and he simply told me not to bring up petty things. Then he zipped his suitcase, told me not to get in his way, and walked past me without looking back, the door closing with a finality like a courtroom gavel. 2 days later, the building management called to say Ethan had requested to terminate our lease, expecting whoever remained to be out by month end. And that same night, I found receipts proving nearly everything in that apartment was under my name. He had left with nothing but his clothes and a few small electronics, and it was that particular coldness, more than the divorce itself, that finally woke something up in me. I did not sign the papers right away. I let them sit on the table for 3 days like a wound that had not yet started to bleed. But the longer I stared at them, the clearer it became that Ethan's silence had already given me every answer I needed. That weekend, I nearly skipped my 18-year high school reunion, but I got dressed anyway. A simple black dress, wine-colored lipstick. Not to impress anyone, just to prove to myself I could still walk into a crowded room without flinching. At the brewery, I ran into an old classmate named Nathan. Divorced 3 years, raising his daughter alone. And we talked easily, without pity, and when he asked about Ethan, I said we were getting divorced and left it there. Driving home, an old song came on the radio, and the lyrics hit harder than expected, dredging up years of cold dinners and unanswered texts. And I realized I had spent years excusing someone else's neglect instead of naming it. The next morning, Ethan called to remind me the lease was ending, speaking to me like an employee receiving instructions, and I told him calmly that I would sign the papers and that he should not call me again. I hung up without hesitation, sat down at the table, and signed my name without a single tremor in my hand, closing a chapter that had rotted long before I finally let it go. Exactly 1 week after my attorney filed the paperwork, Ethan sent me an email with the subject line proof, and inside was a photo of a marriage certificate dated the day after our divorce was finalized, listing his new wife as Melanie Ellis Whitmore. He called moments later, practically gloating, telling me Melanie was the only daughter of a wealthy real estate family in Santa Fe, that her parents had built them a house and handed him an executive title, and that she was already 3 months pregnant. When I asked if that was the real reason he wanted the divorce so quickly, he insisted it was not, that he simply could not keep living with a woman who put work before her role as a wife. The name Melanie Whitmore nagged at me, so I searched it online, and her profile picture showed a striking blonde with sharp blue eyes. But scrolling back through her photos, I stopped cold. Melanie was Melanie Ellis, the girl who sat behind me in high school for 3 years. Quiet, awkward, teased for her crooked front tooth and blotchy skin. I called my old friend Rachel, and she confirmed it instantly, telling me Melanie had moved to New York for art school and come back a different person after multiple rounds of plastic surgery. Though her personality, calculating and strategic, had never changed at all. A month later, an unknown number texted asking if I was free to talk, and I already knew who it was before answering. Ethan's voice was shaking as he told me Melanie had given birth to a baby girl who looked nothing like either of them, and that a paternity test had confirmed the child was his, yet the resemblance still made no sense. I let him sit in that confusion before asking if he remembered his own senior yearbook photo, the one I had found buried in a drawer while packing up the apartment. A curly-haired boy with squinting eyes and acne I barely recognized as the polished man I had married. Ethan went quiet, and I told him plainly that genetics cannot be edited the way a face can, that his daughter would carry the truth of who he really was long after every surgery and every carefully built lie had faded. He admitted, almost in a whisper, that Melanie would not even hold the baby, turning away every time she looked at her, leaving her own mother to step in instead. I told him he had once accused me of failing as a wife for not sacrificing enough, yet he was the one now failing at the one role he could not buy or edit his way out of. And then I hung up and blocked his number for good. Almost a year passed before I heard anything else about him, and by then I barely thought of Ethan at all, because the life I built afterward had filled every space he once occupied. I moved into a small apartment in Boulder with a balcony full of herb pots, cut back my hours, started a weekend art class, and let a quiet friendship with Nathan grow into something real. Then, one afternoon at a used bookstore, Rachel told me Melanie was quietly searching for a divorce attorney because Ethan had cheated again, this time with a new hire at her own company, and that their daughter, almost 3 now, had recently been teased at preschool over something the other kids overheard about her mother's old face. I felt something sink in my chest, not for Ethan or Melanie, but for a little girl mocked for choices that were never hers to make, inheriting the very features her mother spent years and thousands of dollars trying to erase. Ethan and Melanie had built a life out of illusion, polished surfaces, borrowed status, and beauty that was purchased rather than earned. And in the end, it was their own daughter who exposed everything they had tried so hard to hide. I walked home through the park that evening with a croissant from my favorite bakery. Sunlight scattered across the grass, and I realized my life now has no grand drama. Just quiet mornings, real friendships, and a peace I once thought I would never feel again. When people ask if I ever forgave Ethan, I tell them the truth, that I never needed to forgive him. I only needed to finally live honestly as myself, and for the first time in years, I can say that without hesitation. If Sophia's story kept you hooked until the last word, hit subscribe, because the Revenge Tales brings you a brand new story just like this one every single week. And trust me, the next one hits even harder.